I decided to call this talk something that didn't end up in what I sent James, which is Jose Marti and the immigrant communities of Florida in Cuban independence and the dawn of the American century. So, because I want to touch on all those points. And I'm starting with the last image that Rodney used yesterday, although there are many ways to read this, and I'm going to try to be evoking interpretations of imagery, verbal and also visual. This distorted map that obviously refers to the proximity of the USA and Cuba can be read a number of ways. I'm sure you guys can think of a number of ways to do that, but I like it because it, on multiple levels, addresses the issue of proximity, politically, economically, culturally, socially, and that goes for the Cuban community as well as the US community. I'm going to start today's presentation on Jose Marti and the cigar-making community, on Cuban independence and the dawn of the American century by paraphrasing a Tampa native son, Jose Iglesias, on the place of Marti, Cuba, and Florida earlier in historical, and these historical Cuban immigrants on the context of American history. And I quote him by saying, he says, "Let us begin then by officially incorporating them into American history. They're already here." So my purpose today specifically is to talk to you about the cultural world of the cigar work in the context of a phenomenon I call the curriculum of culture. In Tampa, it is a culturally and socially situated set of values that are anchored primarily in Cuban history, culture, and society that conveys knowledge, beliefs, and behaviors to the community. For Cubans and other immigrants to Tampa, this curriculum was predicated on a community-defined and redefined competencies regarding not only how to survive here in the US and thrive in this whole society, but also how to be agents of their own lives and mediate social class and cultural differences. Today, through historical and documentary evidence and information from many oral interviews, we will analyze this curriculum and the culture in which it flourished here in Tampa. Before I start, though, I want to talk a little bit about my personal connection to this place. Over 25 years ago, I realized that I had spent most of my professional life analyzing and reanalyzing my own identity as an island-born, New York City-raised Cuban, through Cuban studies, broadly defined. In researching and writing a manuscript about Tampa's Cuban immigrants, their culture, and that of their descendants, so for which I traveled here more than almost 60 times now in the last 25 years, since 1995, I realized that I had embarked on a journey of discovery. First about the subject I chose, and then about myself. After my first six trips to Tampa, I discovered something truly remarkable. In Tampa, the expression of Cubanness was defined differently and in different moments throughout much of Cuban U.S. history. Furthermore, given its deep historical roots in both countries, this definition made much more sense to me than any other ambiguous one I had learned from Cubans in New York City or in Miami. I had always adhered to the words of Fernando Ortiz on Cubanness, and I translate here, "Full Cubanidad does not consist merely in being Cuban because of any environmental contingencies that have surrounded and shaped the individual personality. The consciousness of being Cuban and the will to want to be Cuban are also necessary." So it was here, for the first time in my whole life, that I actually felt like I could comfortably fit into a Cubanness that I had not experienced in New York or Miami because of the multiple layers here. The story of Tampa and its Cuban immigrants establishes the fact that Cuba and Cuban identity had long been debated in the U.S. long before the island's eventual mediated independence. An understanding of this early struggle for the source of Cubanidad can inform any debate about Cuba, Cuban identity, and its impact on mainstream and other ethnic societies in the U.S. and in Tampa. So while Tampa and Key West may seem like small chapters in U.S. immigrant history, they're not. They're not only important, but they're very large chapters in the history of Cuba. Tampa served as a staging and proving ground for immigrant working class Cubans to produce, reproduce, and perpetuate their identities. And furthermore, that identity, as it was practiced in the community, had a lasting effect on the other immigrants in this city as well. And a little side note on the Tampa community here. Let me see if I can get this to work. In Tampa, it became necessary for there to be a new ethnonym created, which was the BC and the AC Cubans. Okay, BC before Castro, AC after Castro. A very telling distinction, indeed, in a place where history and those who venerate it feel compelled to differentiate two very distinct moments, not only in Cuban history, but also in the creation and survival of Cuba and Cuban identity. And I give you here the Círculo Cubano, which we visited yesterday, and that obviously was built early on in the century, and there was a predecessor before that from the 19th century, and this is the Club Cívico Cubano, which was built by the post-Castro Cubans that came here. And let's just say that there's not a whole lot of collaboration between the two clubs or communities. And as a matter of fact, as evidence, further evidence of that, and this is an image, we stood before this yesterday, the Parque de los Amigos de José Martí, and this park was always open. And eventually, in the last 20 years or so, the Club Cívico community pressured and got support from a local lawyer to have the gates locked, and they control who goes in there and who's not. When people who don't feel like them or who don't espouse their political positions want to have patriotic acts there, and there are people here who can attest to that, like Maura. So this is an image of the gates being closed. I'm not saying this is closed in one of those events when they lock people out, but I just wanted to show you the openness and the close as an image of a lot more than just this park. So, the idea of a sovereign Cuba is the next thing we're going to talk about. An immigration to Key West and then Tampa in the mid and later 19th century revolved around issues of Cuban sovereignty and the cigar industry. Outside Cuba as well as inside, early Cuban emigres continued their fight to free Cuba from Spain and concomitantly consolidate even further the formational elements of their own Cubanness, which they projected onto the greater Cuban cause. They contributed energy, ideas, finances, a safe haven, and even combatants to this dramatic struggle, a battle that in the end pitted old and new world colonial powers against each other and virtually disenfranchised Cubans from their own war and their own victory. The connection that Tampa has to José Martí and Cuba's struggle for independence from Spain is that of having been one of the primary places in which overseas preparations for that 1895 war were made. Pro-independence political activity among Tampa Cubans was so intense early on, prior to independence, that there were over 40 patriotic clubs, Cuban patriotic clubs here, by 1896. Only 10 years after the first workers had arrived in Ybor City from Key West and Cuba. Tampa, which Martí visited more than 20 times in just a few years, as you will learn from Judge E.J. Salsinas, is where he was able to muster support not just from Cubans, but also from non-Cubans, and also operationalize his rhetoric of a raceless revolutionary alliance among Cubans of both colors. While here, he collaborated with several key black and white Cuban patriots, among them Bruno Roy, Cornelio Brito, Rafael Serra, Paulina Pedroso and her husband, Fernando Figueredo Socarrás, Oreste Ferrara, Ramón Rivero y Rivero, José Dolores Pollo, Ramón Rubiera de Armas, General Serafín Sánchez, Esteban Candao, El Hijo Carbonell, Carolina Rodriguez, and more. Some of whom actually lived and worked here at least for some time. Furthermore, it was through his close relationship with Ruperto and Paulina Pedroso, with whom he found much needed shelter and protection. Yesterday we heard about the Spaniards who tried to poison Martí. Well, that's where he ended up staying after that at Tampa in his life, at their boarding house. He also found in Paulina a willing participant for his Tampa performances of racial unity. Again, little did Martí know that the fragile racial unity that he imagined, promoted, and performed in Tampa, something Ann Fountain is no doubt going to discuss during the Institute next week, I believe. This would soon disintegrate by the turn of the century in the United States. And as evidence of this, we have the fact that the multiracial Liceo Cubano, which we stood in front of, although Frank didn't comment, which was a building that Martinez Ibor soon outgrew, and he gave to two people, which I'll talk about later, to turn into a Cuban club. That split in two, and then the Círculo Cubano was where the light-skinned Cubans who passed joined, and La Unión Martí Maceo, where predominantly darker-skinned Cubans joined, although it was open to all. And that was mentioned yesterday. Actually, their bylaws specified that they were open to all, whereas the Cuban club ones did not. And I don't use black and white here because people who could pass went into the Círculo Cubano. In one family, you might have one brother who could go in and one brother who couldn't. And they used to use what they call the paper bag test to see the skin color, okay? And Susan Greenbaum is going to be obviously discussing this in much more detail tomorrow, as a matter of fact. So, here's Paulina Pedroso, and she became known, and I have a copy of the book here, La Madre Negra de Martí. This is their boarding house. And this is the plaque outside the Martí Maceo Club, which we stopped a block away from, but didn't see, which is the building that replaced the one mutual aid society that was torn down during urban renewal, Martí Maceo. Okay. Cuban author and cigar factory reader Wenceslao Galvez y del Monte wrote in his 1897 book, Un viaje a Tampa, a trip to Tampa, about the social and political climate he encountered in Ybor City in the late 1880s and early 1890s. The same milieu Martí himself would have experienced. And I quote, "Here one sees lawyers working as cigar factory readers or stripping tobacco in the factory, selling ice or ice cream on the streets. Doctors and dentists turn the driver's seat of their cars into teaching lecterns in acts of self-denial for the benefit of their compatriots. They accept any job, even the most humble. Ruined capitalists stand behind counters in dry goods stores. Former estate owners are Pullman conductors or shoe repair apprentices, living like students in boarding houses and cheap hotels. As proof that this radical change in lifestyle does not bother them, they are always content knowing that in exile they shouldn't expect anything else. They prefer this life of deprivation and misery to the high life back under colonial rule in Cuba." Galvez's focus on Cuba's exiled professionals and intellectuals, and not only on working class cigar makers, serves to emphasize for us the truly leveling nature of that pre-independence immigrant Cuban community and its politics. Regardless of class in Tampa, collectively they joined the fight for Cuba Libre both in South Florida and on Cuban soil. And while many of the Cubans who came to Tampa before or even after the island became independent from Spain were indeed cigar makers and small business owners, the excerpt I just shared illustrates the socioeconomic diversity of the Cuban immigrant group and how Cuban politics dominated the turn of the century scene. On April 10, 1892, after having given his two most famous speeches in Tampa, both in Tampa, Martí, and meetings with patriots in Tampa, particularly at a place like El Chino Pajarito restaurant in Ybor City, Cuban patriot Jose Martí reported in New York City when he went back that he had approved 34 organizational clauses for the creation of the Partido Revolucionario Cubano, the PRC, which had chapters in multiple U.S. cities and overseas, 7 in New York, 13 in Key West, 5 in Tampa, 5 in Kingston, Jamaica, and 1 in Philadelphia, Boston, Ocala, and New Orleans, respectively. The PRC was an example of a North-South, transnational, and trans-Gulf Caribbean organization. This is the Chino Pajarito. We went by there, but not much was mentioned. It's right almost across from the Ybor factory. And this is, I'll give you an example of a certificate signed by Martin of membership for the PRC in New York. In addition to Tampa being a place where much of the money and arms were collected for the purpose of financing and arming the war, I contend that it is where Martin was able to further sharpen his own ideas concerning the very nature of what a future Cubanness itself might be, all through his contact with thousands of Cuban cigar makers and others in this community. And just so you know, just so you can have, there's another certificate. Martin, you see his signature. This is not the PRC, but a later club of dark-skinned Cubans who left and established this Club Interamericano actually in New York, in the Bronx. And that's another story.
Yeah, I heard about that.
Mm-hmm. Good. Okay. Okay. Excuse me. In looking back on Martí, I want to talk about Jose Iglesias, this native son, a writer who left Tampa to go to New York to kind of make himself as a writer, because Tampa was not a place where he could really do that. It was too insular. He was born to a transplanted Spaniard and a Cuban woman, grew up in a family and community obsessed with, but also touched by Martí. He confesses that as a child, he didn't count, and I quote, his family as a reliable source of serious knowledge about him. There's a lot of myth-making about Martí, and from every side, right? So he felt like all this exaggerated talk of Martí was just a little too much, but he found out differently later on. He was bothered by all the hyperbole, but he had learned from his own Cuban grandfather, who was a reader, a lector, and a cigar maker, Rafael Milian, and other relatives, had actually heard Martí speak when he came to Tampa. So he gained a special new knowledge, a new appreciation, and stated, finally, that Martí, and I quote, Martí is a living presence in Tampa. However, he's also quick to point out that this view of Martí's relation to Tampa existed on both sides of the Florida Straits. He confirms that when he was reading La Biografía de un Cimarrón, the biography of a runaway slave, the testimonial novel that Miguel Barnett in Cuba wrote with the testimony of the former slave and maroon, Esteban Montejo, that Montejo referred to Martí as El Profeta de Tampa. Of his own identity conflict, Iglesias once remarked that in negotiating his multiple identities, Spanish, Cuba, Tampan, that he realized that the solution was to be the right kind of Spaniard, the right kind of Cuban, the right kind of Tampa. All of these identities pointing to specific social and political attitudes. Once he had learned enough about Martí and his indelible footprints in Tampa, and now quite convinced, Iglesias succumbs to the weight of the truth and the history underpinning this community's obsession with Martí. And I quote, I'd like to think that that last and greatest period of his apostleship began, indeed was triggered by his first trip to Tampa. His encounter with the workers of Ybor City and West Tampa confirmed for him what he had been learning all his life in exile. He had now arrived at this knowledge with a full heart and his whole being and expressed it directly, and he quotes Martí, and I translate. What I have to say before my voice dies out and my heart ceases beating is that my beloved homeland possesses all of the virtues necessary to conquer and maintain its freedom. It's also Iglesias who reminds us that Martí always referred to Tampa's Cuban community as El Águila, the eagle, calling the invitation he received from Ignacio Agaramonte to come speak here the call of the eagle. Iglesias writes that a year after the two landmark speeches that Martí gave in Tampa, that he wrote to a friend in Ocala to explain just where even working class Spanish sympathies ran in Tampa. And I quote, "When in front of the Liceo, which had flowed out into the street to hear us, a procession of Spaniards, hundreds of them, paraded in favor of Cuban independence. Extraordinary times are getting nearer." Iglesias explains the impact of Martí's speeches in Tampa, which were taken down in shorthand and transcribed by stenographer Francisco Maria Gonzalez, himself a lector at the Eduardo Gato factory in Ybor City. And Iglesias explains, "Martí was ripe for the workers of Ybor City, and God knows they were ready for him. He knew with his heart and mind that their eventual loving, comradely response was a possibility. But when it took place that first night at the Liceo, it became an epiphany for him. He wrote to the others about these cigar workers and said immediately afterwards at a subsequent meeting in New York, reporting that his time in Tampa was, and I quote, 3 days of immaculate moral beauty." Iglesias tells us that, and I quote, "By the time Martí came to Tampa, he was totally concerned with what had to be done for Cuba. He quit his jobs that he had held as a consul for some South American nations. He had accepted the fact that he had lost his family. His wife left him. He was devoting all his time to the making of the revolution. He had gone through his crucible. Ironically, on the night of the second speech he gave in Ybor City, Los Pinos Nuevos, Martí almost prophetically foretold of his own untimely death as he lauded the death of heroes, and I quote, that tree bears the fruit that is fed by a dead man. Little did he know, his own death was only 3 years away. It was awaiting him during his first foray into battle. And in addition, little did he know, although I doubt he would have been surprised, that the United States would interfere and eventually undermine both the war and any real Cuban sovereignty. For as much as he admired the United States, he was also dead set against its racism and expansionism. Okay. What I have here are a few pictures. These are American troops at Fort Tampa getting ready to embark for Cuba. These are Mambi soldiers training in Tampa. Go back down and fight. This is Teddy Roosevelt in front of the university, the hotel, on the grounds of the Tampa Bay Hotel. And this is an image I want to include here because you know that we're constantly rewriting and reimagining history. This is an artifact you can no longer see. It's gone. This mural, and this is from the artist's website, Jose Rodeiro attempted in his imagination to recreate a mural examining the key heroes of the War of Independence. And I don't want to read the whole thing, but as you can see, he has ordered the figures in a very interesting way. Because as you can see, Teddy Roosevelt's in the back. And Jose Martí and Maceo are at the front. So this mural used to be on a fronton wall in West Tampa in McFarland Park, right across the street from where Mauro Barrios grew up. And it was in decay, and I have my own picture of it, which is not as good as this one, which is why I used this one. But it's gone, it was painted over. It belonged to the city, the wall belonged to the city, and so it was painted over. And that's a tragic loss.
Yes, sorry, Kendra, but now there's a mural that they painted there that is, who's on the mural? Martí's on the mural?
Yeah, it's a
Macedo's on
redone
the mural?
Yes,
also the,
and McFarland is on the
the
mural,
female
and Lisa
lectora.
Capetillo's on the
Maceo's
mural,
still there?
and Fernando Figueredo.
He's on there.
Yeah.
How about Maceo?
I don't think
No,
Marcelo.
I
because
don't think so either.
Of course not.
That's one.
we put Robert Saunders in his
Okay.
place.
Okay. He's good too.
Yes.
Yeah, it's another imagining, right? But I wanted to use this image So,
McFarland
you know, you
Park.
saw some maps yesterday, I want to talk just briefly. In 1886, Ybor City, a small enclave in Tampa, became home to thousands of immigrants escaping difficult economic and political circumstances in their homelands, Cuba, Spain, and then Sicily. Motivated by investment opportunities and production problems, a select number of Spanish and Cuban businessmen, among them Martinez Ybor, for whom the enclave was named, or at least for his father's name, brought to Tampa the one manufacturing industry that almost single-handedly fueled the city's economic boom, the hand-rolled cigar business. So basically, this is already a unique community as an immigrant community to the U.S. because they didn't come here looking for work, it brought the work with them. The relocation of this industry, first to Key West and after the 10 Years' War, which was after the 10 Years' War failure, and then from Key West to Tampa, after many strikes and a devastating fire, fueled immigration of first hundreds and then thousands of highly skilled Cuban workers to a small town of under 800 people. In 10 years, the population had grown sixfold. By 1900, it was 15,000. Thanks largely to the influx of Cubans, Spaniards, and Sicilians in that order of relevance and importance. By 1930, the city's population was over 100,000. 25% of that population was Cuban. The industry was established in Tampa, was Cuban, and a large percentage of its workers were too, essentially guaranteeing that Cuban culture would end up being the de facto cultura franca here. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about this curriculum of culture. The way I've organized this talk is there's going to be a break in the middle for questions and also for other kinds of break necessities. And then the second half is going to be on my work on the theater, which is why I started all this in the first place, but it was impossible for me to talk about the theater without learning all this other stuff first. So, a partial catalog of some of the almost daily elements typical to the lives of cigar workers that made it very easy for them to remain predominantly Spanish-speaking and connected to their cultures included being able to spend the day speaking Spanish and conversing with lectores or fellow tabaqueros as they worked. In addition, most, if not all, of food and other supplies they would have found here that their families needed to purchase were purchased from bodegas, or small markets that sold the kind of food that they were used to eating. And there were Cuban bodegas, Spanish bodegas, and there were Italian bodegas as well. But those, after a couple of generations, those things got kind of mixed up, right? So it's imperative to also look at key aspects of working in a Cuban-style cigar factory that ensured the survival of Cuban and other immigrant cultures. They lived in delimited ethnic enclaves. Ybor City was surrounded by white Tampa, southern white Tampa. It literally was like an island, as it was referred to by an earlier local historian. It was an island. They constantly received new immigrants from their home countries over generations. This created a vibrant, multifaceted society that, because of its lack of access to the kinds of services that southern white Tampans had, created their mutual aid societies modeled on what they left back in Cuba and other places. And these mutual aid societies became their multifaceted place to go for healthcare, for domino, for brisca, for food, for dances, for lessons, all kinds of classes, etc. And they also had myriad coffee houses and fondas of their own, and there they gathered to share the ideas. So in other words, they heard ideas in the factory, they had ideas among themselves from the newspapers and the local news, and they also had coffee houses in which to circulate these ideas. And, as I focus on, they created and promoted popular theater, their own popular theater, and other cultural activities couched in their cultures and values. So I'm not going to focus on the impact of union activity, which was sort of like the fourth pillar of this, because this is not part of my research, but obviously the Union Hall was the fourth pillar of this curriculum of culture circulation along with homes. I will say though that early on in this facet of Cuban life in Tampa, in 1899, after an important strike, local Cuban cigar makers, many of them anarchists, created the Society of Tampa Cigar Rollers, or La Resistencia, in part to organize under their own terms to practice racial inclusion, oppose the nativist, racist, and AFL-supported Cigar Makers International Union, and function independently. So they created a union that was multiracial because the American union was not. This Tampa Cuban community, this habitus, can be seen as a milieu through which individuals and groups of individuals learned how to behave through mimesis, mimesis, or imitation. Such a combination of social and cultural factors allowed Tampa Cuban and other residents to reproduce their social structure, find solutions to their community's problems, and shape their futures. Behavioral psychology also tells us that people learn behaviors through observational learning, social learning, and then imitation, with the expectation that they will be rewarded or punished. So in other words, to be a good Spaniard or a good Cubano or a good Tampan meant to emulate the best of the behaviors that were existing in those communities. Historian John Bodner argues that the thoughts and actions of some immigrants promoted their unique culture, mentality, and consciences, and they were able to create a new kind of culture. And I quote, "This culture was not simply an extension of their past culture, or a simple affirmation of a desire to become an American. It posits that the immigrants claimed and deployed personal and collective agency, using their knowledge of the past to shape their future and stay positive about their current situations." Educational historian Jeffrey Morrell contends that despite the fact that immigrants to the U.S. were still attached to their cultural traditions after arriving, they also became attached to American democracy, explaining that although they learned about American history and patriotic allegiance to their new country, they were also able to put, and I quote, "their distinctive stamp on them," and in effect create a new kind of America and Americanism. In Tampa, the collective Latin identity became an identity-establishing manifestation of this sense of collective belonging to a community signifying a form of togetherness that a group attempts to foster through a search for common ground. Hence, because of this curriculum of culture, what began in the 1880s and 90s as discrete immigrant group identities, Cuban, Spanish, Sicilian, eventually transformed into what could be seen as an increasingly collective one by the late 30s and early 40s, due partly to the Depression, generational change, Depression, and also because of World War II. This collective Tampa Latin identity combined elements of all three groups' traditions and values, a few of those embraced by Americans, and allowed them to evolve from immigrants to ethnics to Americans. Importantly, though, their brand of Americanism did not typically display the competitive individualism often associated with traditional Americanism. Instead, they emphasized living as a community and fostering cooperation and affiliations amongst numerous social, cultural groups. This is the seal of Ybor City, and I can't believe I left this, I'll bring it tomorrow. This seal was on the flag of Ybor City. It's changed now. Now it's like a seal with a cigar in the middle. But this seal shows you the marriage of these four communities. The U.S. community, the Cuban community, the Spanish community, and the Italian community. All the colors represented there. One of the steamships on which they used to come back and forth from Cuba. It's a very telling flag. And actually, when I first came here, I bought one, and I forgot to bring it this morning. Sorry, but I will bring it. Because it's a lot more than just that seal.
We'll see that at the speakers here tomorrow, I think. I think it's at the speakers.
Yeah. The impact of this curriculum of culture, sorry.
What year?
This is marked 1886. I don't believe this seal was created in 1886. I don't know but I would say it's probably by the 1930s, but I don't know.
I didn't hear that question.
Huh?
What was the question?
When did the Ybor City seal get created?
That didn't come up till about 1952.
Oh, there you go.
When Tony Pizzo, who was really the spark that brought so much Havana, Marti, Tampa, Ybor City. And Tony is the one that designed that, and he did not use the Olivet that you have,
Yeah.
or the mascot. He used the other
Yeah, the Hutchinson.
ship
Yeah.
called the Hutchinson
Yep.
that nobody ever talks about in Tampa.
Yeah.
But that was a very important of the three.
Thank you. There you go. So the impact of this curriculum of culture, this culturally situated set of values that convey knowledge, beliefs, and behaviors is contingent on community-defined and redefined competencies. And so basically it helps immigrants survive in their host society, but it also helps them thrive in the host society and allows them to be agents of their own lives here, which is not often the case when immigrants first come to a new host society. These immigrants not only transformed this place culturally, but they also did it architecturally. And there's a lot of it left, although a lot of it is a little unrecognizable now after all the changes, but they transformed a city whose dominant population, identity, language, and culture was white Southern, English-speaking, and segregationist. Okay. This is an ID card for a mutual aid society, for the Círculo Cubano, Jorge Mascuñano Cruz, from Cuba. I just wanted to show you that. And then I want to show you, this is the, after the Liceo, that was the first Círculo Cubano. And then by 17, the building that you saw yesterday was built. And I want to show you the other mutual aid societies. Centro Español de Ybor City on the left, Centro Español de West Tampa. The Centro Español we were by, but it's totally unrecognizable because it's a restaurant now and part of that Centro Ybor, which is like Coconut Walk, whatever, in Miami. Centro Español de West Tampa is still there and was with the Urban League and now belongs to some kind of community education project. Here's the first Unión Martí Maceo. And there's La Unión Italiana, sorry, I wrote Sicilian, I got that on the brain. Martinez Ybor Factory, there are the steps we were on yesterday, took a picture on, there they are, without us on them. That's going to be a keeper, that picture, definitely. We should, the website, we need to have like a picture of Martí with all those people and then us, right? Perfect. Mutual aid.
We have to crop out the Scientology.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, thank you. Absolutely. The very people responsible for Tampa's growth began their new lives in enclaves that would eventually remain segregated from the rest of the very same city that benefited so immensely from their presence, their hard work, and culture. The fraternal benefit societies, Tampa's Cuban and other Latin buildings, known as mutual aid societies or sociedades benéficas, were a product of much needed, necessary autonomy and self-reliance. There was not only a history of these sorts of organizations among Cubans, Spaniards, and Italians, they also became a necessity in Tampa because certain aspects of their host society made them indispensable. With roots in mutualism and cooperativism, the many services they offered and the philosophy behind them, outsiders often refer to them as social clubs here. I don't like calling them clubs because club implies only a social purpose. They were much more than that. This term club denies them the complex nature of their operations and their importance. The concept behind these societies is a clear example of this curriculum of culture that I talk about at work. Facing a denial of medical and other services due to white Tampan discrimination, mutual aid societies fashioned after Hispano-Cuban models were built by each of the three major ethnic groups. And we kind of went through them already yesterday. And there were also clinics But the Centro Español and the Centro Turiano had full-fledged hospitals. They eventually built their own hospitals. There were also many clinics, and actually almost right across the street from the steps where we were, used to be El Bien Público, which was one of the many clinics. Treyes Clinic, Gonzalez Clinic, there were just a bunch of them. And these hospitals were full-service institutions and treated most of the community for decades after their establishment, even after healthcare became available. Because people through membership in these societies would have access to healthcare there. And there were similar institutions in West Tampa. These societies were state-chartered, voluntary, fraternal organizations with a representative governmental structure that for a monthly fee offered benefits such as in-house health services and hospitalization, functioning much like an HMO, burial insurance, workers' compensation, instruction, even American citizenship classes, theater and other cultural events, gathering places, dances, and meeting rooms for members and community residents. Eligibility in these clubs, however, to use the term club, was not a matter of simply signing a piece of paper and joining. You had to have two people from who were members vouch for your good character to join one of these societies. And that kind of also ties into this idea of this curriculum of culture. In other words, the two people recommending you for membership, if you were a newcomer to the place, meant that they were confident that you would be a good Spaniard, a good Cuban, a good Tampa. So one had to be sponsored in order to join one of these organizations. And their existence didn't just constitute a safe haven for members of each of these ethnic groups. It was also a place where members would continue to keep up their language and culture and perform, perpetuate, and experiment with their national and new incipient identities. We all know what that is. The coffee houses. The coffee houses, so what the mutual aid societies and cigar factories had in terms of order and structure was exactly what coffee houses didn't have. Which is why they were so appealing, and still are, for sometimes informal, but sometimes very serious conversation. Sociologist Ray Oldenburg analyzes the general public good performed by cafes and coffee shops and other such places, explaining that the essential function that public meeting places have in established and aspiring democratic societies is that they function as a third place, a place between home and work, as ports of entry for visitors and newcomers, as staging areas for social and political activities, multi-generational settings, and entertainment and mutual aid centers as well. So, and I can tell you very happily that there are coffee houses here that still function that way. And Tanya, who's new to Tampa, can already attest to that because we went to one in West Tampa on Saturday. These sites became meeting places at which the curriculum of culture was the unwritten script of the day. When one takes into account that the curriculum of culture circulating at the factories and coffee houses spilled over into the streets, the homes, ethnic clubs, union halls, and theater, it becomes clear that cultural performance and performativity were constantly reiterated at all levels of Tampa's immigrant society. Something Oldenburg asserts. Third places are political fora of great importance. Moreover, perhaps the most important element of coffeehouse culture is that it is also a leveler. A sort of a mid-17th century English term that refers to anything that reduces men to equality. And we heard that early on when Wenceslao Valdez, when he was talking about the lawyers and so on who were doing menial work here. A concept to which I alluded earlier, as I said, these coffee houses today still continue to serve as a meeting place for regular groups, traditional and contemporary, sites for politicians to visit and chat with folks, and venues that provide safe spaces to connect past to present, and present to future while they serve up old-style fare and very strong Cuban coffee, which is the way it should be. Okay, next thing I want to talk about is lectores. And we saw some pictures yesterday. One, another one, another one. And this, thank you, James. This is James' grandfather, right?
Yes, that's my maternal
James, right? He
grandfather.
sent, many years ago, he sent me this image. It's like, it's, el mundo es un pañuelo, yeah? This is his father's identification as elector. And this is, I think, the other side of it.
I think it's interesting also how it's bilingual.
Yes, it's bilingual, yes. And this I had to include this, you know, just because West Tampa always gets forgotten. I just think it's really cool.
It's your-
His uncle.
That, huh?
His uncle.
It's your uncle? Woo! Okay, I just wanted to say, definitely West Tampa had the sexiest, most stylish lector, okay? Viva tu tío! El conde de West Tampa.
Del Consejo de Pravia.
Del Consejo de Pravia. Check it out, man.
Joaquín de la Llana y Rodríguez.
There you go. So I'm glad I included that. See, this is the kind of thing I was telling you that happened when somebody in the middle of my talk, 20 years ago says, that's me.
Yeah.
This is, I wanted to show you this is a copy or an image of a list that the capitán of the fábrica, the workers would elect a capitán, who was the guy that collected the money to pay the lector. So the workers would give money to pay the lector on a weekly basis, and they auditioned the lectores and hired them. So I'm sorry, Nilo Cruz, but you made a mistake in Anna in the Tropics because no cigar factory owner hired lectores, okay? That's not the way it went. And now, I just want to show you an example, most of them predominantly men, but Luisa Capetilla, Huepa. Luisa Capetilla also was a lectora here, so I just wanted to include that there. Lectores, another crucial element of the Cuban curriculum of culture, were the people who read to cigar workers in factories while they worked. These should be considered radical for two reasons. One, because the tradition is unique in an industrial context, and two, because in Tampa the content of the reading was not only mind-expanding, but also very au courant with the local curriculum of culture. The custom traces back to early 19th century Cuban jails, not Spain, as was mentioned yesterday, and where the lectores read to prisoners, and then later in 1864 in Bejucal, where a reader was hired to read to cigar makers there. In Tampa, the lector became an essential part of labor culture. Historian Luis Perez Jr. reiterates Martí's idea that the factories were like colleges, a veritable system of education dealing with a variety of subjects, including politics, labor, literature, and international relations. The newspapers they read, the lectores read, tended to be in Spanish, some locally produced, others not. Many of them sight-translated, meaning they read, as was alluded to yesterday, whatever the language was, and translated into the lingua franca of the factory, which was Spanish. And I'm going to skip the names of them all. I do have them, but I have them here, some of them. They divided the day by reading newspapers in the morning, or, yeah, mostly newspapers. And in the afternoons, they read literature for them, world literature. And sometimes other stuff as well. So among the works that were most often read included Cervantes, Balzac, Dostoevsky, Villaverde, Galdós, Jules Verne, Dickens, and Victor Hugo. Les Misérables being the favorite text among them because they really identified with Jean Valjean. They also read to the workers works by Marx, by Kropotkin, and Bakunin, to name a few. So you can see where the workers then, the owners could consider them as a radicalizing influence on the workers through the literature and also the theory, and also because of the papers they read to them. And as I explained, they auditioned for the workers, they were hired and paid by the workers. But this tradition ended in 1931 when there was a decision on the part of the cigar factory workers to disallow this practice because they considered it subversive anti-management propaganda. And I have to say, they were kind of right. Unfortunately, that was replaced by popular radio, which is like, kind of like the dumbing down of the tradition.
Well, it was right after a strike. wasn't it?
Yeah, right. They did a huge strike, but it didn't work, the workers. It could have been a death blow to this immigrant identity, but then came the theater, especially, and I'm going to focus on the Cuban variety, which essentially took over, I'm saying locally written theater, took over where the lector left off. The year when lectores were banned from the factories, that is when the local written theater began to emerge. And I'm going to stop there. I want to show you this. There's a cigar label with Victor Hugo, so you can see that actually he was a really strong, important figure in the imaginary of the, and you can see this from the O'Halloran, which I heard yesterday was an American factory, but anyway, I'm going to take a break. You're going to take a break. We can have some Q&A. You may leave the room to do whatever you need to do, and then we'll come back.
Okay, that came later.
Yeah.
They started pushing out the lectores in 21 and 22. Then the cigar manufacturers had to give in to the workers because they were the employers of the lectores. But then in 31,
Se acabó.
ya acabó.
Yes. What a good question. The Catholic Church was in the community, but I can tell you from what I've read and what I've experienced in my interviews is that the majority, a lot of the working class community did not baptize their children or really support the church, but there was an active church in Ybor City, OLPH, I think that's the name. Yeah.
Let me also, as a footnote to your excellent presentation, in the coffee shop, in the cigar factories, there was always the
The
cafetero
cafetero, yeah.
who would come in the
With
morning,
big trays like this.
and you had your little cup. Sometimes your little cup was a can of condensed milk that you had washed real well, and you would keep at your place in the cigar factory. In the morning and in the afternoon, the cafetero would come in with two big,
Like this, Joe?
what do you call where you carry carafes, where you carry the boiled milk and the espresso coffee.
You need coffee to work.
And while you're working,
In the afternoon especially.
he is serving you. And he got to know
Cuban coffee, by the way.
so well that he knew if this one liked it light or dark or took it just espresso. Twice a day.
Solo. Yeah, excuse me, yes.
Hi, thank you so much. I was just wondering, from the readings, it seems that the political affiliations of the workers were also a really big part of their lives, and I was wondering if perhaps even in the coffeehouse spaces, they had different, maybe that was part of the leveling process of, like, this would be the anarchist coffee house. And this
I
would be-
can't answer that. I can tell you though that coffee groups, coffee clutches often were divided along ethnic lines. Not always, but
So it's
often.
also ethnically divided.
Yeah, not entirely, and that may not have been the case early on, but definitely, in my experience, since I started coming here in '95, I have participated in many coffee clutches, and it tends to be. Although the Italians kind of like, the Sicilians kind of do their own thing, and then the Cubans and Spaniards, they're mixed, so they kind of hang out together. But yeah, everything was very political. This was what was running through their veins, Yeah, I'm sorry, I saw a hand over here.
Sorry, I just didn't know if I heard you right. Did you say that Rafael Serra was in Tampa?
Yes,
Certain point?
yes.
And the other thing, it's also a small point. So you're talking about the Club Interamericano
Yes.
in the Bronx.
Yes.
Someone shouted from the audience, we're going to hear more about that. But I didn't know who. Is that you?
Moi.
Okay.
Susan Greenbelt.
So, okay.
Mañana.
Tomorrow.
Mañana.
Okay.
So when radio came in, was it Spanish radio? And did any of the lectores move to that form?
I don't know that. Did any of the lectores become radio announcers? Many of them went into theater, yeah.
My grandfather's brother, my uncle Mateo, was also a very popular lecturer here, and he ended up moving to New York and became a very well-known radio personality on Spanish radio in New York. So I know at least that one case that made records that showed up. If you all remember that program on NPR, Lost and Found
Oh, yeah,
Sound.
Lost and Found Sound.
They did an episode on these records
Yeah.
that he made.
They also
up
did
here.
one on Manuel Aparicio.
He had a
Yeah.
nickname of El
El
Mexicano.
Mexicano, that's
Yeah.
right.
And my son-in-law married the grandson of El Mexicano.
So
And
our
we've never been
families,
able to figure out how they called him a Mexican.
they call him out. I can clarify that story. So my grandfather and his brothers were sons of a very well-known lecturer in Havana. My great-grandfather, Francisco Rodrigo Rosabal, who was from Oriente, and he had a very indigenous coloring and look. And they gave him the nickname in Havana as an actor, El Mexicano, even though he was Cuban, because he looked indigenous.
And did he come here? Because there was an
He
actor
came
in
here,
Mexicano.
yeah, he came here with his two sons, and his
Yeah.
two sons succeeded him in the lector business.
Interesting.
Yeah, I have pictures of that too that I could show
Oh,
later.
well, that'd be
but,
great.
yeah.
Yes.
So, I'm wondering then, how does Tampa workers and Martin himself envision this Cuban nation? Meaning, is the idea to go back to Cuba? Or is this imagery of Tampa and Florida and so forth as an extension of this nation? Is it
Yes
a
and no, and
trans-off?
we're going to kind of look at that in some of the theater that I have found, because that gets discussed generationally. Through the theater, so that it's, it's about sovereignty. And first of all, by the way, that's one of the things that should have been mentioned yesterday, is that of the three large ethnic groups that came here, Cubans were the ones who were the least economically successful. And it's not because they didn't work hard, it's because they could easily go back and forth. So when things were bad here, they went back to Cuba. When things were back, bad, no work in Cuba, they came here. Whereas the Italians and the Spaniards who came could not go back. It was, the old world, and they could only go back once they had money, like the whole idea of the Spanish Indiano who would go back to Spain and build a house and so on and so forth. So the Spaniards and Italians early on started getting into business, like their women became teachers early, they got into liquor, they got into real estate, groceries, so that it was different because there was always this seamlessness. This was seen as an extension. Kind of the way Miami sees itself now.
Because it kind of made me think about this book from Puerto Rico, The Nation on the Move.
The Nation on the Move. Exactly. That's what, for the Cubans, that's the way it was here. That's the way it was. That's a good question. And you're going to see, I'm going to trace this through some theater. Because the kind of theater that was performed and what the content was, which, by the way, all farce, it's all funny, deals with this sort of ethnogenesis of the Cubanness. First of all, it sees Cuba as a conglomeration of multiple identities in Cuba. And then what happens when people get here and then the next generation is born. For the first generation or two, for example, there was not a lot of intermarriage. For example, the Sicilians wouldn't let their daughters marry Cubans because even if they looked white, there was always the suspicion that they were racially tainted, whereas the Spaniards were Europeans, and so there's a whole lot of that goes on, which I'm sure Susan's going to talk about tomorrow. But after a few generations, and one of the plays we're going to look at is about an intermarriage. Yeah.
Sort of talking how Cubans go back and forth. Do we see an influence in Havana of things that can be traced to Tampa? Size-wise, they're so different, but because of the sort of placement of the cigar industry being so important, right?
Actually, there's even a neighborhood in Havana called Calle Hueso. So, there was.
Okay.
And it's like I say, if Esteban Montejo in Cuba is calling Martí el profeta de Tampa, it's like, I've never heard that used before, and I think it's remarkable, right? So, but we're gonna go through some of the theater, and like I said.
Some would argue Cuban bread is an export of Tampa.
One of my favorite stories about Flores, which I think might be apocryphal, and maybe EJ knows whether this is true,
that when the stock market crashed, the lectores got that information ahead of anybody else here in Tampa, and they told everybody. And the workers put their chavetes down and they went to the bank and got the money out before the run had started more generally.
That would be nice if it's true. That's a great story. Yeah.
That's fascinating, I've
You've
never heard that.
It may not be true, you know.
So
I don't
I'm-
know how they would have heard, through the telegraph or something.
I have no idea, that's fascinating.
Anyway, that's.
I'm gonna just step out a second and get a sip of water. And I'll be right back.
Absolutely, we'll
Yes.
start up at.
You have a bottle up there, Kenya, that would.
We have a handout that has just some brief translations of sections. This theater is all in Spanish. I'm presenting in English, so I'm gonna present the lines from these plays in English, but the original Spanish is there, and you know, it's impossible to capture all the humor, but I tried as much as I could to get at least something reasonable out to you, which is an exercise I need to go through too, because I have to write about this and publish about this. This theater, as I said, is unpublished, and we're going to be talking about theater both from Cuba that was presented here, and then also theater that was written locally by cigar workers in Spanish and presented here. Although when the Cuban theater came here, it was often the case that local actors and actresses who were Cuban and Spanish performed mixed in with the Cuban companies. Okay, so we're going to talk about Cuba and Tampa. This now comes obsession time. I had to give you all the background. And so I want to talk about Cuba and Tampa, and these images, and they're not very good images, but I just want to show you a few images, a series of images that have to do with Cuba and Cuban theater and Cuban performance. And these are children dressed this is in West Tampa on that side, at the Club Juvenil de West Tampa from 34-35, children dressed up as mambis. These are El Baile de los Guajiros on the left. You can see that this is an identity, and we're talking about the 30s, an identity that is still being promoted. And I'm going to give you a few more. This is a beautiful, beautiful image with the girl with the gorra frigio and the flag and the soldier. And we were here yesterday. You can see that in Ybor City, the street is, the avenue is called República de Cuba. This is the window. This is the window of that was on the second floor there of the Cuban club. But this is from the inside with the sun coming through. And this just, this is an image I took. And I think it's beautiful, and what you can see here is that there are 6 Cuban flags, one for each of the provinces, the original provinces. Now, this is Cespedes Hall in West Tampa, which is no longer there and hasn't been there for a very long time. Yesterday, it was called a gathering place, and yes, it was a gathering place, and EJ, correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't Cespedes Hall kind of like the City Hall for West Tampa?
The what?
The City Hall, the Ayuntamiento,
Absolutely.
yes, it was like the City Hall, so it wasn't just a gathering place, although it was that too, and it also contained a non-segregated school, as there was one in Ybor. So now we're going to talk about theater, and I just want to show you some of the talent that came through here and some of the stuff, and I mean, this could go on forever, but Ernesto Lecuona was here, and his, actually he had plans to come back and put on a production of Cecilio Valdez, but he became very ill, and eventually was never able to come back and died rather young. This is a 1962 presentation of Cecilio Valdez in the Círculo Cubano. Here's Cecilio Valdez, and these are the actors, and I actually have met a number of them, and one of them, Salvador Toledo, is the author of a number of the plays that we're going to be talking about. This is the stage there at the Cuban Club. This is also the stage there, and this is the audience. It was not the largest of the theaters. The largest theater was the Centro Suriano Theater, which is where the Federal Theater Project, the only Spanish language theater project in the country during the Depression that was funded by the government was in Tampa, and they did their work at the Centro Turiano, which had a 1,200-seat theater. The Círculo Cubano had about 900. Okay. I want to talk about the Ajiaco Cubano. Okay, so when two cigar workers, Jose Santos and Pedro del Rio, turned the former cigar leaf stripping building that Martinez Ybor had donated to his Cuban workers, they turned it into a theater in late 1886. It soon became Ybor City's first theatrical venue. It was called El Liceo Cubano. In early '87, it opened with what would be Ybor City's first stage debut, a performance of Amor de Madre, a Spanish adaptation by Ventura de la Vega of a French drama. So it sets this tone for the kind of theater that people would have been seeing in Cuba as well, except for the buffo. A lot of your, Spanish either translations or Spanish drama, that changes after about a generation. It's difficult to say given the lack of documentation, but it's very likely that this theatrical debut is the first debut of any kind of theater in Spanish or English in Tampa. The building, as I said, was promptly named the Liceo Cubano, and it became home to patriotic, educational, and cultural activities. Between 1891 and 94, a period of intense Cuban nationalism here, the building was a hotbed of political activity and was visited by Jose Marti, where he spoke to unite Tampa cigar workers behind the cause of Cuba Libre. This fervent early activity, and particularly its performative events, paved the way for what would become a long and healthy tradition of Cuban theater and Latin theater in Tampa. Dramas, comedies, musical reviews, variety shows, operas, farces, and zarzuelas. Mostly amateurs, mixed groups, and professionals alike, many of whom were cigar workers or lectores, performed these shows in Ybor City and West Tampa. And in addition, I want to say this theater not only served as education and entertainment, but also focused on fundraising to help a mutual aid society member or family. So these theaters, these troupes, were all housed within a mutual aid society. In this case, we're talking about Círculo Cubano primarily. Although there was one in Centro Turiano and one in Centro Español, and they did opera at the Italian club. So this is something that they had a sección de declamación, and that was the theater section. So they often would raise money for a sick worker or someone who needed to go away to get tuberculosis treatment in the Carolinas, or even to raise money to buy ambulances for Spain during the Spanish Civil War, that kind of thing. Hurricane relief in Cuba, that kind of thing. As U.S. Hispanic theater expert Nicolás Canelos describes it, and I quote, "Theater was the business of the Hispanic community at large. In Tampa, it was more a shared communal responsibility than in any other city they've studied." So in other words, he looked at LA and San Antonio and New York and all these other places, and this is what he said about Tampa. After the new Círculo building was built with its 900-seat theater, and a building that included a cantina, farmacia, etc., its sección de declamación immediately began contracting professional companies from Cuba, which brought with them several very popular buffo plays, but they also focused on strengthening their own in-house companies. Buffo, which is not the same as opera buffo, is a Cuban genre that was born of its Spanish predecessor and that incorporated a lot of native Cuban music, among other things, that reinforced their connection to Cuba here. Typically, buffos can be best described as light-hearted 1 to 3 act plays containing satirical language, a lot of double entendre, sexual innuendo, music and dancing, a kind of formulaic farce of high and low society. Often the buffo contains many stock characters, but one of them that I can't talk about a lot today because of the lack of time, but I'm happy to talk to you about, is the stock character of the negrito, the black man, who is almost played by a white man in blackface, almost always, although there are some notable exceptions to that here in Tampa. And I want to say that this figure emerged in Cuba, as I say, but in Tampa that figure evolved along with the society, and so the negrito by the 1930s and 40s often was the one who won out in the end, in the sense that his cleverness, his picaro nature, got him to win out in the end. But they also allowed them, and you'll see in one of the excerpts, to say things that were not said in Tampa, in the Latin community, about racism, for example. So as I said, I can't do a full discussion of this or its evolution, but I'd be happy to discuss it, and as well as the issue of racism and discrimination. But in my book, I will be devoting a lot of time to this figure, the blackface figure. So what made this genre so popular was its humor, its musicality, and its satirical nature. Although in retrospect, what made it extremely instrumental, as far as I'm concerned, is that it was a site at which the immigrant community could process its experiences as a transplanted but a very still Cuban-connected community. In addition, it was a site where the writers who began to write the local theater began to propose, review future possibilities for the identity of Tampa Latins as the generations went by. To quote to refer to somebody like Boal's view of strategically purposeful theater, the instrumentality of Cuban bufo theater in this context was to move the members of the audience from being spectators to being agents or actors, to inspire and promote reflection and discussion. And in this way, Tampa's Cuban theater was, and I quote, an enactment of a composite experience that all participants, audience and players, recognized and at the moment responded to emotionally. So multiple repeated performances became entrenched in performativity. So it's part of this curriculum of culture. You know, bufo emerged in Cuba during the pre-independence period, mid-century, and it altered fashion here. And it's still actually used in Cuba, although it's criticized by some. And it's also used in Miami by some companies, although often it's not in the blackface anymore. But this originally island Cuban genre eventually became very inherently Tampa Cuban. Tampa playwrights use it as a most efficient tool with which to comment on social, economic, political, and cultural realities, not only in Cuba, but also among Cubans and other immigrants here in Tampa. But the first 15 or so years of theater here really hadn't found its own voice. As I said, the Spanish theater, translations of European theater. But finally, Tampa began to find its own voice, and while it still modeled itself on this precursor from colonial Cuba, it became extremely Tampeño. But anyway, even though the Círculo Cubano was contracting Cuban companies to come here, this still emphasizes the seamless nature of the relationship with Cuba. For a Cuban company to come here and play to an audience here was like playing to an audience in Havana or some other place in Cuba. They were still extremely connected to that identity. I'm talking about this here, sorry, because this is, Fernando Ortiz talked about Cuban identity as being an ajiaco criollo. So, you know, I always like to use the fact that, well, we all know that the old world had to conquer the world because their food really was bad and they had to find good recipes and spices and people to enslave and stuff like that. But this is the ajiaco criollo, and unlike the cocido español, it has, you know, corn, which is from the Americas, and it has, you know, different kinds. It has malanga, it has plátano, so it's really much a fusion. And that's kind of how I like to look at the Tampa Latin community here once it begins to merge, the three communities begin to merge. And I also like to say that actually, as I say, Cuban anthropologist Fernando Ortiz talked about Cuba's unique culture, Cubanidad, and he said, it was a complex process and the ever-changing results of a mixture of cultural elements from different world areas. and the characteristics of the consciousness and attachment of people who consider themselves Cubans, despite their birthplace. That's Cubania. Okay? This is all him. So, for him, the metaphor of the ajiaco, and I quote, that never stops cooking, its ingredients are constantly renewed, mixing with each other and dissolving into a broth. A reading I prefer of that is that it doesn't matter whether or not you have legal citizenship. You can be born anywhere on this planet but acquire the awareness of being Cuban, passionately desiring to be Cuban. But if I could talk to Fernando Ortiz today, I would use the sandwich cubano metaphor instead, because that sandwich originated here. And it was called the sandwich mixto, and it used to have the ingredients of the community. So it had the roast pork, which could be Spanish, but actually it had mojo on it, so it was Cuban. It had the southern ham, and it had mortadella, so it included the Italians. And it had the Swiss, like the German cheese, so that's a genuflection to the German Jews and the Eastern European people that came here, okay? And pickles, also from this community. So it really embodies that fusion of culture, and I would show him this and say, this is the new version of the ajiaco criollo, okay? What's that? Yeah, well, anyway, now you guys have handouts, and there are excerpts that I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to read some fragments of that obviously are in Spanish. I'm going to read my English translations. These are all unpublished plays. So
I would just add, and the Cuban bread, which was invented here.
Thank you very
Cuban bread was invented in Tampa.
Thank you very much. I forgot about that. I went away from my notes. Which, by the way, there is none better than La Segunda Central in Ybor City. Okay? Forget Miami Cuban bread. Forget it. Just forget it. So I'm going to talk about a play that I think is about the Cuban ajiaco. And it's called Revista Nacional. So these are all plays I have recovered. And I do mean recovered. They weren't waiting for me in an archive, or no one handed them to me. They're not in anybody else's work. These were things that I either recovered personally, not this one personally, or that were locked away in a safe at the Cuban club, at the Círculo Cubano, and were not accessible for a long time. And I'm going to leave that there because that's another story. That's going to be over a beer at night. Okay. So in a lecture, as I say, Revista Internacional. And this is from the same script, but you have the first cast and then you have the second cast here. So it's local and island Cuban. The content of Revista Internacional, which I call International Review in English, is a 1927 play by Ernesto Varillas. I have not been able to find anything about this man, but I'm not giving up yet. It was performed in Tampa in 1929, and perhaps most accurately illustrates the national, ethnic, and racial multiplicity of the Tampa Cuban melting pot and its implications for performative agency in the Latin community here. We have a cast that was made up entirely of local talent, and I want to point out that, for example, on the left, you see there are people like Chela Martinez, but you have Belia Martinez, who became very famous on Cuban television, and a number of other people who went on to be, some of the earlier plays have El Mexicano, but I don't have that one up here. So anyway, in this play, we have a playwright, Ernesto, who must deliver a manuscript to a certain theatrical company within a week's time. So he has to write a play in a week. The name of the company is left blank, and Brillas, the author, recommends that the company that's doing it should include their own, company name. Frustrated by his lack of inspiration, Ernesto even considers borrowing a French or Spanish play and parodying it, because parody was big here. Suddenly, upon seeking heavenly intervention from a deceased friend, a muse called the Revista appears and promises to take him on a theatrical journey so that he might see popular types, street scenes, and different theatrical genres around the world. The muse suggests that Ernesto can pick and choose his favorites and use them, The idea being that these international elements will become part of his Cuban play, the diverse constituents functioning as parts of a whole, of a greater whole. So the first character, Revista, who we will call Review, brings on a street vendor, a pregonero, a very common figure both in Havana and here. He's singing his wares to potential customers in modified assonant rhyme and finds himself unsuccessful attracting customers because people think that he's charging too much for his sweet potatoes, for his boniatos, right? So he begins to talk to himself. He has a dialogue with himself. After this, Iglesias pulls his potential playwright and the Tampa audience into this all too familiar dialectic. Even before the street vendor's appearance, Review has already accurately described him and his song as the inspiration of the common people. That's the pregonero, the vendor. In the next scene, he introduces another familiar character in the local imaginary, the Spanish immigrant, buen gallego, as they would say here, who meets up with the street vendor, and the pregonero begins to instruct the Spaniard, who's newly arrived right off the boat, on how in order to fit in here and be successful in Tampa, he has to adopt the local dialect or slang. And this is the first excerpt you have here. And the street vendor says, you have to start by learning local lingo. Yes, sir. Do you know what you have to say when you go to a place and order some food? Yes, sir. Well, what do you say? Bring me some soup. I told you you don't know how. You have to say, serve me up a whole lot of soup, and I want to see some potatoes. So it's in Spanish on there. And the guy says, oh, well, yes, sir. And here, the street vendor says, here, you have to bust a gut. Bust a gut? With blows? Blows? What blows? Don't be an idiot. No, sir. Here you have to bust a gut working, man. Okay? So although the street vendor, a real street rogue, tries to steal the Spaniard's money, another lesson of life in a big city, he also makes it abundantly clear that in order for the immigrant to survive, he must abandon his backward Spanish ways and get in touch with the local scene and language. The scene that follows, which Review warns is very current, involves a linguistic duel between a worker and a factory owner. In it, the owner complains that workers' demands are unjust, that they just reflect their desire to live as the wealthy do, to which the worker responds that they just want their proper share. And this was written in octosyllabic rhyme in Spanish, and I tried to do my best with the translation. If workers make a claim, it is surely with good reason, burdened by their pain in their miserable situation. The poor man drags a chain as if he were in prison. Just because we are workers, are we always to carry the shackles of prisoners? Is it a crime to tarry? The owner, whose name is Capital, responds with a threat to bring in scabs or new workers, confiding in the government's ability to force them to succumb, and in that manner do away with this flock of lowlife, as he calls them. The worker, in turn, makes a hortatory call to arms, appealing to the workers to launch a war against capital. Again, this is the translation. You may provide the news for us to hang ourselves fighting, but if the people do not lose, someone else will end up dying. As we have focused on our attack, and on our fraternal devotion, our children will not lack even a home or basic nutrition. For if that were to occur, our struggle would promptly be staged with the raising of our banner. Against capital, a war would be waged. The currency to which Review, the Muse, is referring it's obvious. It's, the labor struggle here, in Cuba and here. This poetic struggle between the worker and capital is illustrative. It's as illustrative of Tampa Latin social and political ideology as of Cuba's in the teens, in the 20s and 30s. But what's amazing here is that it's done in the constraint of traditional rhyme, which is a millennial tradition in Hispanic letters, reminiscent of the duels between opposing figures in morality plays, the controversia, like in El Libro de Buen Amor. And this contains the essence of and the controversia contains the essence of Cuban, Spanish, and Italian worker sentiments, a logical outcome of their varied misfortunes in their homelands, and the motivation behind their collective immigration to Tampa, and to organize into their societies and unions. So despite the seriousness of the topic, Iglesias instills these and another number of scenes with intense choteo, this Cuban joking, very sharp joking, innuendo, but he also manages to reinsert a politically current topic as a backdrop to the vendors' troubles, rising socialist activism and increasing interest in anarchist teachings in and around the local unions and cigar factories. In keeping with Brilla's penchant for alternating between popular, political, and poetic scenes, the play's final 9 scenic subdivisions each deal with some aspect of theater or popular music as part of Ernesto's rapid review of popular types, street scenes, and different genres. In the first mini-scene, the author patiently proposes for both Ernesto and the audience that Spanish-style drama is no longer a viable vehicle for this kind of theater, not the kind that he wants to write for his contemporary audience. So the figure of Spanish drama enters lamenting that while his heyday has come and gone, he also acknowledged that it is now review's finest hour. And that's the next excerpt. So, Spanish drama comes on the stage. He says, "Gentlemen, it is with great pride that I have come here before you. I am drama, but alas, I've died, and there's nothing that I can do. In a not too distant past, I shone brightly like a flame, and to no one was I last. Spanish drama is my name. So many well-known authors I have served to line the purse of. They now say my time is over, that my poetry is the worst. Perhaps the truth they're speaking, those new enemies of mine. The review is up and coming and preferred during this time. So writer, if you fantasize with fame and lots of money, join the future and modernize. Bring on the lights, the music, and the ladies." So in this scene, Brillas clearly indicts Spanish drama, the kind that was popular early on and continued to be popular in Centro Español, by having the old gentleman himself confess to the fact that he's too antiquarian, politically uncommitted, and even out of touch with current musical and theatrical trends. In the following 8 rapid-fire scenes, the author dismisses American music, an opera, a Spanish zarzuela, a jota, which is an Asturian folk dance, a couplet, a Mexican song, a tango, and a variety show for falling short of the one genre, that one style that will bring together all these elements, seen and unseen, that Ernesto needs to write to an authentic, meaningful, and successful play for his Cuban and Latin Tampa Cuban audience. Finally, when someone asks if there is anything else to see, Género Cubano, Cuban genre, enters and takes over the stage and calls to all the other players. "Come on, brothers and sisters, this is the end of the line. What do you have to say? I know I'm not the best. Well, I've always supported artists, but I'm also not the worst, and they're all my worst critics." Género Cubano exhorts his theatrical comrades to take up a veritable theatrical independence struggle, whose triumph will bring about the inclusion of all the previous Cuban styles, of all the previous Cuban theater, a truly popular and democratic theater representative, inclusive of everyone. Género Cubano continues, emphasizing that it's precisely because he is accused of illegitimacy and anonymity that he sides with the common people. He's not a product of the majestades, but rather of the community itself, and needs no paternal source as long as he has fraternity. And he says, "They say I have no father, that destines I am to fail. I'm here to show you, brother, that Cubans hold the victory pail." Upon hearing this, a criollo, the street vendor, and a policeman initiate a musical call and response, to which even the Italian tenor and the Spanish drama and a Cuban mulata join their voices, all for the benefit of the Cuban play that Ernesto is going to write, Revista Internacional, in which the Nacional becomes the logo, just like in Tampa. And the criollo says, "What did you think of this part?" Talking to Ernesto. Street vendor said, "Tell me if that doesn't make you feel criollo. It is so inspiring that even if Pelayo came back to life, he would become a Cuban citizen." Ernesto says, "I'm definitely going to write the review." The criollo says, "And now since the end is due, and to give you inspiration, we'll show you the conclusion of the international review." And at the end, all the players get together and sing, each one by one, give testimony to the fact that they're leaving their past to join the present. This is the playwright's final appeal for all different performers, each representative of a different demographic reality in the Cuban context, to come together and form one unified people. Now, the next play It's called Los Espejuelos de Machado. Gerardo Machado was a president / dictator in Cuba, and he was well known for his glasses, so this is a joke about his glasses. But anyway, in the 20s now, they were a heyday of this imported Cuban theater, and the best known companies from Cuba came here. All of these highly regarded companies, which dominated the marquees in Havana, contributed substantively to the local efforts to bolster and promote Cuban identity. Contributing to that and also embracing working class ethics, workers' rights, job and economic instability, and the U.S. influence in Cuba. One of these plays, performed by the Baby Colina group, which is a famous Cuban company, that was joined by members of the Círculo Cubano's own adult and children's theater group, was Las Vacas Flacas, the skinny cows, which is a referral to what happened after the Depression. They used to have the 20s as Las Vacas Gordas, the fat cows, and then after the crash, the skinny cows. And there were also plays such as El Tabaquero Huelguista, the striking cigar maker. So what we're seeing is that what's happening is emerging in this popular theater. El Tabaquero, the honesty of the worker, con todos y para todos, with all and for all, quoting or paraphrasing Martí, the cigar leaf stripper. Here's one that's very important in the 30s, cigar-making machines or death of an industry. Yeah, so the one play that I want to focus on now is a play that focuses on white upper and middle class Cubans in Cuba in the 30s who are wannabe Yankees. They want to become like Americans, unlike El Pueblo. And there's another character then who goes in this play, goes out of his way to prove to people in the U.S. that under Gerardo Machado, Cuba was progressing economically and a great investment opportunity for American speculators. Okay, so in Los Espejuelos de Machado, and that's the front page, which is a 1927 play, a one-act play by Antonio Ramos and Bolito Gutierrez, who is a famous figure in Cuban theater. It's a perfect example of a play that was written and performed for Cuban audiences on both sides of the Florida states. The authors were Cuban. It's cast Cuban and Tampa Cuban. In this play, Mr. Photoplay, a correspondent for a famous U.S. film magazine, Photoplay, which was one of these Hollywood magazines, travels to Cuba at the request of a Cuban arriviste during the time of Prohibition, between 20 and 33, a period that in great measure overlaps with Machado's first term. Yet the second half of the 20s was also a period of economic instability in Cuba due to the sugar market's up and down movement and expenditures by Machado to do all the public works for which he is so famous. So Mr. Photoplay's assignment is to photograph the wonders achieved by Machado in this tourist paradise for the U.S. reader. But the money generated by these grandiose projects was distributed very unevenly in Cuba, and better served the interests of Cuban investors and American interests. And that set off a dramatic increase in protests by workers, by university students, by unionists, and Machado brutally repressed those protests, and I do mean brutally. So in other words, the Yankee photographer stumbles upon all this quite by accident, and he is a guide that's going to help him navigate all this. So wealthy protagonist Don Jaime is responsible for inviting Mr. Photoplay to gather this visual evidence of the new, wonderful Cuba, an act that does more to reflect his own financial success and his aspirations than any real improvement for everyday Cubans. When he tries to discuss this with his wife, this is in Cuba, Doña Sinforosa, when he tries to discuss the wonders achieved by Machado, she, with newspaper in hand, retorts, and I have to say this in Spanish, "Deja de what I quería y lee." Stop your foolishness and read. We can assume that she is referring to the articles in the newspaper about Machado's darker side, his dictatorial aspirations, violence against communist workers and students, the reorganization of the army, and his general brutality. So when Mr. Photoplay arrives, Don Jaime orders his black manservant, Tintorero, to serve as his guide around the city. But the photographer only wants to see what he wants to see. Follows him around and discovers an unexpected reality. It is precisely here that the author stages a play within a play, and it's a sort of meta-theatrical strategy so that Mr. Photoplay, whose lens is preset to see only U.S. interests and pro-Machado Cuba, has an encounter with the population whose diverse opinions about the reality totally belie Don Jaimez. So, for example, there's a character called Calles, there's a character called Gallego, there's a Político. La Prensa tells this guy, we are told publishes only the truth without delay. The politician, Cuba Libre, is a drunk woman who explains that she drinks to forget because of the tragedy that occurred after her sons died in the War of Independence and she saw the American flag go up on that one. Okay? Then there's a guy, Liborio, who has a huge farm called Cuba. And he cultivates, not sugar, potatoes, yuca, beans, tobacco, and he wants to grow anything else other than sugarcane so he can be independent of the sugar market. And then there's like a little dialogue between apple bananas and talking about how they're superior to regular bananas that are coming through United Fruit Company. There's a drunk who defends Bolshevism. And it goes on and on, and it goes on and on. So, Liborio shows Uncle Sam, Uncle Sam shows up. Uncle Sam shows up and congratulates Liborio for having been able to sustain himself after the world sugar markets collapsed. And he reminds him, I'm your friend, Uncle Sam says. I'm your friend. If you need help, come to me, right? And Liborio thanks him very much and says that he doesn't need his help, that he puts his faith in God and tells Uncle Sam, who shows Uncle Sam a copy of the new trade agreement that Machado has signed with Spain, which allows them to sell, because the U.S. controlled what Cuba could sell during those first 30 years. So in other words, this play totally takes apart this argument that there's a tourist paradise in Cuba that everyone who lives there is living in, and that they're living in a different Cuba. There's another play, Yo quiero ser senador, I want to be a senator, and this is another one I recovered from 1927, and this one I do have an author for, Felipe Rivera Mateo, and it's about a member of the Cuban bourgeoisie who thinks he deserves a seat on the Cuban Senate. And his pretense and affectation lead him to speak to his family in peninsular Spanish, not Cuban Spanish, but he's also decided that English should replace Spanish in his household because it's a language of power and progress, and could also guarantee him his coveted Senate seat. He's even willing to sell his daughter in marriage to an American banker. In one scene, Don Serafin explains his designs in a mixture of Spanish and very bad English, and you have this expert here. Good night. Understand? Well, all right. Blanca se casará con Mr. Robert tan seguro como que hay God in the sky. He goes, how great, how pretty, how excellent, how beautiful, how. And the manservant in the back is saying, is there a dog around here? Because I hear barking, right? So this is all there, you have the English there. And then the rejected potential son-in-law, so the girl, his daughter's in love with someone who happens to be an actor, by the way. And he doesn't want that marriage to take place, so the rejected son-in-law, potential son-in-law, who's an actor, decides to use his skills and his future father-in-law's lust for English and American power to beat him in his own game. So he takes on the role of a rich American banker in disastrous Spanish, but Don Serafin praises it in his own terrible English, hoping to make points with him. So he plays a banker that he's going to, quote, sell his daughter to in marriage. And Serafin says, pero dígame, mister, ¿cómo usted siendo americano habla también el castellano? And Raúl says, and Raúl is the actor, the potential son-in-law. Oh, mucho poquita, solo 2 mesas en Puerto Rico. And Serafin said, pues lo habla usted como un nativo del país. So he's kissing up to this guy big time. The marriage takes place immediately, and it's only afterwards that the trick is revealed in English. In addition, Don Serafin receives a letter from the nominating committee letting him know that he's not been selected as candidate for the seat, the Senate seat. So he immediately realizes that his intense faith in English and the benefits of imitating American customs has all been in vain. As it all has backfired, he addresses his household quickly to retract his position on English, and I'm going to do this in English. Let me tell you something. From now on, I do not want to hear a single word of English spoken in my home. So clearly, in addition to the hilarity and the criticism, the play is very revealing. One, because this play was written by Cubans for island Cubans, but was totally readable by Cubans in Tampa. And the bilingual wordplay requires that their audiences be at least sufficiently linguistically competent to recognize and understand the malapropisms and the horrible pronunciations. A potentially logical assumption given the insipidly bilingual, bicultural nature of this community, both in Havana and here. Now here we move up, and in this one we have un blackout in Ybor City. So I'm trying to trace up so you can see the continued presence of the Cuban satire and identity. This is a play from 1943, and this play, written by Salvador Toledo and Jaime Fernandez, which debuted on May 2nd of 1943 and is set in Tampa. So the play's title recalls the mandatory blackouts during the World War, where U.S. cities had to turn off the lights because there was, the fear of invasion, so that way they couldn't see the towns to bomb them, or the cities to bomb them. So there are only a few direct references to the war in the play, rationing, for example, and getting sent to the front. But the plot concerns a white Cuban trickster, a picaro, and a negrito, the black trickster, who plan to simulate a blackout at the birthday party of a friend. So these guys are hungry, they don't have work right now. This rich friend, or wealthy friend, is giving a party for himself on his birthday, and there's going to be a lot of food there. Their plan is to abscond with the food under the veil of darkness and leave all the others hungry without chicken. Okay? So, the play also contains abundant examples of how much English had crept into the Spanish of Tampa, Spanglish. For example, instead of switch, they would say Swiss, or quota for a quarter, doble closet for a double crosser, and plehuki for skipping out on school. Furthermore, there's also a comment in here about racial discrimination and mistrust between the two scheming thieves. Vitola, the negrito, sizes up Cabecita, the white guy, for the project in hand, since it's actually he who is going to pull the sluice, and turn the lights out, because they're going to simulate a blackout. It's not a real blackout. And he defends his mistrust by reminding Cabecita that he had once before betrayed him when Vitola was denied admission to the Círculo Cubano. And he says, como soy de color y no podía entrar, me tuviste esperando hasta las 12 de la noche. Since I'm black and I couldn't go inside, I had to wait for you till midnight. This is not only evidence of what I said earlier about race in Cubans in Tampa, but no small condemnation of the segregationist practices at the White Cuban Club that was written into the play itself. So for all the comedic antics, shortly after Cabecita and Vitola shut down the lights at the friend's house, and a third party makes off with the chicken, that's when the real air raid sirens go off and the play's most important and final scene takes place. The real darkness, after the simulated blackout, causes all kinds of mischief to come to an abrupt end. The citizens of Ybor City have to turn their attention to the business at hand, the war and national security. It is then that the following exchange takes place between the wily Cabecita, another white Cuban ne'er-do-well, Iglesias, and the Spanish Regueira. And you have this here. Cabecita says, don't be afraid. Don't think that they are going to come and bomb this country, the cradle of democracy. Those scoundrels know perfectly well that this great nation and its allies are ready to erase from the map forever those fascist governments in just a short while. Long live the democracies of the world. Down forever with fascist governments. Let us receive with open arms the valiant defenders of world freedom and say goodbye forever to the fascists. And Iglesias begins to sing a patriotic song, and then Cabecita says, hurrah, old man, You was always a good worker, like a cigar worker should be, always on the side of freedom, and with God's help, it will reign around the world as the policy of good neighbors does in the Americas. Another day. Iglesias says, what do you think, Regueira, being a Spaniard? And he says, yes, I am a Spaniard, but a Republican Spaniard. Not a Franco Spaniard, that puppet of Hitler who sold his motherland in order to stay in power. Long live Spain, but Republican Spain. So in the late 20s and through the 40s, provided the political context here, we can see that they began to experiment with embracing American identity seen as democracy. And after that, then came, in the Depression came the WPA programs, which also had a role in Americanizing, to some degree, the population. These events launched the Tampa community into a clearly observable, politically motivated makeover. Nowhere is this process more obvious than in the cultural sphere, not only in theater, but in music, dance, and film. So I want to show you this. I'm sorry, I think I misplaced this slide. I came across at the Italian club, I came across a manual for a citizenship booklet for training in Italian by the Daughters of the American Revolution. So clearly, this was at work. Okay, now, this play is called Tabaqueros a coger el cheque. So it's like, let's go get our checks. And that's the way it was spelled. This is a local play also written by Salvador Toledo and his collaborator Jaime Fernandez, but this is one where we begin to see the Americanization. So this is a riotous comedy that introduces the topics of ethnic intermarriage, class consciousness, modified assimilation, and interracial cooperation. In a word, working class solidarity, Tampa Cuban cigar maker style. So this, in the play, the Cuban, Tampa Cuban, Robusto Peón, is married to a Sicilian woman, Rosina, which signals the introduction of a new stock character to the traditional figure four. The inclusion of the Sicilian character, married to a Cuban, also provides insight into a new kind of marriage that didn't happen before. It wasn't acceptable, and they talk about it. Prior to this, Tampa Italians, Sicilians deemed marriage between a Sicilian and a Cuban entirely inappropriate, owing in part to the fact that they perceived Cubans as being racially and culturally impure. In fact, the play begins with the husband and wife reminiscing about the great difficulty they had with her family after the marriage. The success of their union is a performance aimed directly at this idea of promoting a multi-ethnic identity, a no-nonsense appeal to the Tampeños to put the collective above the national when it came to survival here at this time. So, to make Rosina seem more believably Sicilian to the audience, they create a constant tension between her Italianized Spanish and what her husband and other characters understand her to be saying. And so, as we're going to see now, the scene that we're going to share here is when Rosina confesses to the terrible mistake of having sent her last check just before a big strike to her cousin, now dead cousin in Italy. And she does this in the presence of a Galician small restaurant owner, Madreña, with whom they would like to marry their daughter for the sake of economic stability. So, confusion abounds about the Italian word cucino, which means cousin, and cochino, pig, and meschino, unfortunate one, and meschino, stingy. So here we go, and you have this expert. Oh, peone, peone. And he spends the whole play correcting her pronunciation of his name, of his last name. It's peón, Rosina. Well, what the devil is wrong with you? The cochino of my cochino has died. And the Spaniard says, what? A pig has died? That's nothing to cry over. Send it over to me, and tomorrow I'll make the best pork and yellow rice in the world. And then Peón says, what she means is that the cochino is her cousin of hers. You mean she has a pig for a cousin? No, I'm talking about my cousin. So Peón says, poor guy, even though I didn't know him, I feel bad. And Rosina says, meschino. And Madreña says, if he was stingy, he should have died sooner. No, meschino in Italian means poor guy. Oh, poor guy. Then in comes the daughter, Mary, not Maria. And they tell her this guy has died, and she says, well, I guess it's okay to feel bad, but not to cry this way. After all, we didn't even know him. And Rosina says, I'm crying because I cashed my check and sent him all the money. Okay? Behind the linguistic antics of this action taking place during a time when the factories were either shutting down or experiencing dramatic slowdowns due to changes in the tariff laws of the tobacco coming from Cuba, it's the play opens with her announcing she's about to go pick up her last check, hence the title of the play. And we know about economic difficulties because they want to marry their daughter, marry off to the presumed well-to-do gallego, Madreña, who owns a fonda, a small restaurant that caters to cigar workers. What they don't know is that the fonda is broke. And the Madreña is thinking of closing it. And he says, La fonda no tiene fondo. As I say, the fonda has no funds. And the very same economic crisis that is putting cigar workers out of work renders them incapable of patronizing their usual stores, coffee houses, restaurants, which entirely cripples the economy of Ybor City in West Tampa. The U.S.-born Mary, and I said not Maria, the U.S. who has grown to have more American ideas about courtship and marriage, initially disagreed with her father and mother about marrying Madreña. The situation allows the authors to interject some of the tension concerning immigrants and their children, their two languages, and their different cultural and social values. And so Mary comes in one day and she says, "Hello, Daddy." And he said, "Hello? Nobody's pulled anything here, sweetheart. Tell me, why are you so late? I had a date, Papa." A date, huh? And see here, don't call me Papa because that sounds like a vegetable. Call me Papa. "Oh, Dad, do you think we're still in Cuba? Wake up, we're in the USA." And he says, "Well, even if we're in what you say, I'm still your father, young lady, and you have to follow my customs in case you didn't know." So for a moment after he explains to Mary that the gallego has $20,000, or at least he thinks he does, she seems to be more willing to see things her parents were overlooking, several notions, really negative notions she has about this gallego, stereotypes about them. But she's bothered by the idea because, in essence, the guy would be buying her. And when she discovers what he actually wants to do is marry her for love, because he does love her, despite the fact he's poor, then she truly wants to marry him, as the following exchange illustrates. So Madreña says, "So, you wanted me only for my money?" And she says, "No, that's where you're wrong. Now I really love you, poor, because this way we can both be bringing the same thing to our marriage, love." And Madreña says, "That's the Tampa Latin woman, who gives herself for love and not for money." So since Madreña ascribes to Mary the merits of a Tampa Latin woman and not an American one, it's a celebration of working class virtues embodied in a woman, and that kind of renders any resistance the father has useless. And he identifies her as Tampeña and not as a Cuban or anything else either, or an Italian. So that we see a sort of an evolution in this identity. Likewise, any resistance that Mary might have had to marry a Galician was also met and conquered by Tampeño ideals of working class solidarity. The Spaniard, who was first viewed as a good catch for the family because he was a member of the merchant class, is finally loved by his bride to be in his family because he's now one of them. Ooh, and they're all in it together. So to conclude, I just want to say, there's the manual, sorry. I just want to say that these earlier Tampa Cubans came for political and economic reasons and intentionally tried to manipulate the political reality of their homeland in the name of sovereignty and democracy. In a presentation at Florida International University in February of 2000, Maura Barrios, who's sitting right over there, a locally born and raised historian with Cuban roots and also a dear friend, explained her own search for a better understanding of her Cuba and Cubanness and that of her hometown, Tampa, in the following way, and I quote, "The historical writings on this community disappear Cubanness and Cubans." And they do, because yesterday they mentioned how in the 30s, the sort of tourist, they tried to start selling this as a tourist place, and there are umpteen photographs of women dressed as Spanish señoritas with fans and all this stuff, and had nothing to do with Cubans, okay? The majority ingredient in the multi-ethnic meltdown here was Cuban. In my attempt to recover Cubans in the history, I noticed the construction of multiple identities in response to a variety of social, economic, and political forces. I continue to quote, "In the beginning, Cubans and Cuban institutions in the form of cigar factories, mutual aid societies, and lectores defined the immigrant enclaves of Ybor City in West Tampa. The Cuban independence struggle organized with Jose Marti reinforce a commitment to Cuba and Cubanidad. That agenda required a commitment from all Cubans, working class as well as black and white Cubans. In referring to the importance of Tampa for Martí, she goes on to suggest that it is reasonable to assume that the Cubans of Tampa influenced Martí's vision. Quoting Gerald Poya's work on the Cuban experience in the United States, Barrios writes, "In time, Cubans accepted the inclusion of non-whites and non-Europeans in notions of Cubanidad. Cuban communities in the United States, and particularly in Florida, were in the vanguard of accepting and promoting a multiracial version of Cubanidad." Close quote. These ideas persuaded Cubans in the U.S. that they were all Cuban regardless of race. But Barrios goes on to acknowledge that others, like Alejandro de la Fuente and Luis Perez Jr., might suggest that Martí necessarily hammered on the race theme because before 1895, Cubans had been reluctant to wage a war for independence because of the race problem. And in fact, we know that one of the reasons for the failure of the 10 Years' War was indeed that. Personally, I don't see these as mutually exclusive positions, and I hope my work on documenting and analyzing the Cuban curriculum of culture here in Tampa, enduring contact Cubans in Tampa had with island Cubans over many decades, and the social politically oriented working class theater of Cuban and Latin cigar workers in Tampa, which has its roots in Cuban colonial farce, has convincingly revealed that the cultural world of the cigar worker in Tampa can be defined as much by its cohesive interconnectedness as by its distinct but inseparable elements: Cuba, Jose Martí, and cigar making, and their impact on other immigrant ethnic groups in Tampa, U.S. politics, history, and culture. Tampa bore, and to some degree still bears, the indelible distinction of being an essential locus for understanding Cuban identity, transculturation, and the rise of the American century. And I want to end with this slide, if I'm not out of order here. These are just taken, these are all local cigar labels, or box labels, that kind of hint to the imperialist, expansionist view. If you go from the top left, you have the sort of indigenous princess representing Cuba. You have a Statue of Liberty in the back, and then you have Colombia. In the middle, you have the Tampa girl, who's a Tampa girl, but in the background you see El Morro. You have La Flor de Luis Martinez on the right, where you see this very condescending view of Cuba with the standard of Spain, you know, with these children representing all of the ethnicities involved. And then in the middle you have the Little Sammys, a cigar that was produced here for Uncle Sam. Musariana, I've tried to research the source of that name, have no idea, can't find it. But anyway, here you have her with the American shield and the Rook of Spain down in the bottom, and then you have the Cuban scenery in the background. On the right, you have Los Inmortales, where you have the celebration of American historical figures, and then the last image that we started with, this view of them being interconnected places so that easily Cuba could be seen, not only Tampa could be seen as part of Cuba, but more importantly, Cuba could be seen as part of the United States. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.
You know,
That was a marathon.
then you know that Musa Ariana is, no, it seems to also be a code switch, you know, entre Musaraña.
Yeah, I know.
And then it's spelled with a double O instead of with the U, and the Ariana instead of the Araña. No?
Who knows? Who
I
knows?
wonder, yeah, it's an interesting idea.
So, questions? Yeah.
So you talked about, thank you very much for that session. You talked about, in the article, I think you mentioned that Tampa became one of the top places for repression against unions
Yes.
in the early 20th century. And by 1937, that was firmly really anti-union repressive place.
Yeah.
What is the relationship? Have you thought about, or have you talked about the relationship between the staging of these particular plays?
Between what?
The staging of these plays that advance.
Oh, absolutely,
worker rights
absolutely.
with,
As I said earlier on, these plays were entertainment, but they were also education. They were also education. And I mean, I can tell you because I've interviewed at least 2 of the playwrights who are no longer with us, who they had no idea that they were doing it. This was what came naturally to them because that's what this kind of genre was about. In Cuba, under colonial rule, those first Bufo plays were basically condemnations of Spanish colonialism in Cuba. So this is the genre lends itself to that. So, and as far as the intense anti-union activity here, you can imagine, you know, we saw yesterday, you know, the 720 Tampa, you know, income, the Latinos, especially the Cubans with the cigar industry. This is a city that grew and whose white majority and the power elite was primarily white and southern, that literally lived off this industry. So, of course, they're not going to want to give much agency to the workers as it is. And by the way, there was an international movement against the unions. But I mean, here you have a minority. You know, I mean, it kind of sounds familiar to me, like nowadays. You know, you have people who are the minority who are keeping things afloat and producing the economy, who are not a product of the dominant society. So, but yeah, the plays were definitely meant to do that.
But
there are
I'm
many
wondering
others.
about the interconnection between the plays and the union movement itself
Absolutely.
more directly. And,
Absolutely.
and also whether or not there's any precautions or security considering the repressive situation.
I have not come across that. There were certainly incidents at certain plays, and the Federal Theater Project, I mean, this is one, I couldn't talk about this, but the Federal Theater Project ended up doing a 17-city debut of a play adaptation of It Can't Happen Here by Sinclair Lewis, and the one here was done in Spanish, but it was done in a way that didn't really allow for the company to do well at it, because they sent them a tremendously horrible translation from Washington. Well, the title was Esto no lo puede pasar aquí. Okay, so you know they used Google Translate. Okay, back then, and so the thing is, they didn't allow the company here. They didn't give them the time to adapt it to the current reality. Like when the Yiddish theater did it, they adapted it and they played up more of the fascist things. You know, when the Negro theater did it, they played up other. I mean, they got to play it. They got to own it. But that didn't happen here, and it didn't do well here. And then the state director attributed that to the fact that it was too sophisticated and that that the audience didn't get it because they didn't know enough about it. So it's like, these are people who are dealing with the Spanish Civil War, with Mussolini. I mean, this is ridiculous, right? But this is how much they didn't know of this community.
So on that play, I was really curious if you thought at all about whether or not the casting of the English-speaking bilinguals as the fascists in the play and the Spanish-speaking bilinguals as the the voice of reason and critique, if that contributed at all to the way that play didn't function, or is there any way to find out?
Which the play, the Revista Internacional?
No, It Can't Happen Here.
Oh,
is there any way to know?
No, they didn't do that. It was all in Spanish. But they didn't change the names or the costumes or any of the anything. They didn't localize it at all, and that. It was not popular here. But at the same time, they were doing their own theater that did a better job of this. Yeah.
What are the factors that led? Because I was curious about that in the reading. What are the factors that led to the fact this particular theater group, out of all the 17 cities or whatever it was, and other groups that were doing it in other languages, had so little time and terrible translation?
Here, I don't know. I mean, I have to say it was probably because Florida wasn't really on the radar. Because if you study the history of the Federal Theater, New York City takes up 95% of the attention. Okay. But this did debut in 17 cities. But I mean, when I go back to look at the documentation, all I can see is this rather flippant attitude by the state director. And I mean, the fact, why didn't they send them the play to translate?
Well, that's what I'm saying.
But I don't know.
Like the other groups had all this.
It was the Federal Theater Project, so I guess.
Their own into Yiddish, right?
Yeah.
It's just so weird that Florida was like, oh.
I don't think it was.
We do this in Tampa too, I suppose.
Yeah, I don't think that it was. There was much forethought there, So. And in fact, the only reason that there was a Federal Theater in Tampa in Spanish and not in San Antonio or Los Angeles or New York, where there was a much greater Spanish theater tradition, I mean, larger, more professional tradition, was because 2 local guys wrote to Washington and told them and encouraged them to bring it down here. That's the only reason it ended up here, which I'm very glad for. So, yeah, no, as far as the union activity goes, I have not done a parallel study of how, I didn't find enough plays to be able to say, okay, well, in this year this was happening. There's very little material. Yeah.
This question relates to that. Un tabaquero's acogida cheque, Lucina sends her check to her cousin, and you said that was because there was going to be a strike?
No, she didn't know there was going to be a strike, but she sent her last check before there was a strike. She didn't know there was going to be one, and so therefore, she sent her last paycheck to the Chino. And that's, and you know, that's, she's not crying because her cousin died. She's crying because that was the last money coming into the house. Yeah. Anybody else?
El nombre madreña, ¿sabe lo que es?
Sí, yo sé lo que madreña is a wooden shoe, a clog, with like, it's got like these little things on the keep you up out of the water and the mud. Yeah.
Cleats. Cleats.
Cleats. Yeah, that's a good word. Thanks. Anyone else? Yes.
Kenya, you focus on Cuban Tampa identity being a kind of a melting pot of the three different cultures, perhaps.
Eventually, yes.
How does that coincide with contact with the island or Cubans on the island? As Cuban identity here increases, develops, does contact with the island subside?
No.
It continues?
No. Mm-hmm. No. But what happens is the acknowledgement that there is now a blend of these three ethnic groups that still has a, you know, I mean, it's got the stamp of Cuban culture on it, but by the time the 40s roll around, the 30s and 40s roll around, especially the 40s, then, you know, then you have an acknowledgement in the plays. So you see new stock characters. In some plays you find an American. There's a play that was written in the 50s, which is actually the one that deals the most with racism. Actually, there are two versions of it. La Familia Tenguillo Goes to Clearwater. In the first version from 47, there's blatant anti-black American racism and kind of joking black Cuban racism. And the son of the protagonist is the one who says this stuff that's so, you know, horrible, offensive. By the 1952 or 3 version, then you have the father criticizing the son. You know, so no, but the contact was always, I mean, the contact remained till after the revolution because there were 26th of July clubs here. Okay? And that's a whole other story.
Is there any documents or literature in Cuba that shows the Tampeños as different animals?
I don't know. I can't answer that. I can't answer that. Yes?
I'm just curious about the cultural memory. You said you recovered a lot of these plays, so they're not, are any of them performed at all today? It's just kind of as of...
No.
Never.
And they're not published even.
Is that going to be maybe part of the effort of your criticism in putting this?
Absolutely.
It's going to be published?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. But I mean, you know, there are, I mean, I now have a corpus because I finally got access to the stuff with the Ciro Cubano, probably 55 plays or so. But I personally recovered probably 9 from somebody's suitcase that they had in the closet and that kind of thing. And I scanned them all finally when I had access to them. But I'm not, I mean, they're not all worthy of comment, of my analysis from my book. In other words, because I'm looking at, you know, I'm looking at the evolution of the community. I'm also looking at the continued connection to Cuba, and I'm looking at things like race, and to some degree gender, you know, and things like that. But I mean, I'm not going to publish a comprehensive collection of these plays, and I would have to translate them all to make them accessible. But
do you think it's had any impact on local theater in Tampa, or just the fact
early on, a few decades ago, there were some local people like Dennis Calandra at the University of South Florida who did a play like he produced something called Why the Y and Ebor. Tampa is known for its performance in the sense that, for example, once a year you get the Rough Riders reenactment, you know, just like they do Civil War reenactments, of the Martí reenactments, even EJ has done that. You know, people here, the people who have roots here, are really enamored of their history. And there were, I should say, a number of very solid local, unprofessional historians who have written about this community. You know, without training, but because they have a passion for studying the history, according to them, right? So, but no, as far as, after 1962, I found pieces of manuscripts that were obviously written by AC Cubans. But they're not complete and they're not good. So, I'm not interested because that's not a period I'm really talking about.
So, was there a theater here before the building of the social clubs?
No, so I said this, that's why I said that the debut in '87 was the debut, very likely the first theatrical thing in any language here. Yes.
Since you have Stand All 55, are you thinking about building a digital archive?
Yes, I am, and first of all, the collection up at USF needs serious help because it's there, but it's not really cataloged and there are no summaries and stuff like that. And so I've told Andy Muse that I would be glad to work with, like a student or interns who could be working to catalog that collection. But, and yes, I would like to, well, let me just say that 25 years ago when I first started working here, Special Collections, I gave them photocopies of what I had found, which was like 9 plays. They weren't interested. They wanted original. I said, well, it's like, it's either this or nothing. And then, that's kind of my, this was pre-digitalization, so yes. But I have to talk to USF about it. If not, we'll do it here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Next space.
See?
So on the one hand, there's this blending of identities, but on the other hand, we also see this subversion of racial hierarchies when we see Cubans undermining or deriding Spaniards, Italians, and so
Absolutely.
forth. So that's an interesting way that it seems that they're not only speaking to Tampa audience, but they're also talking about or making the claim to belonging to the American body politic.
Exactly.
So, and along those lines, can you speak a little bit more about how does this play out? You show us at the end this father and daughter and the issue of Spanglish. Do we see something like that in the Cuban community?
What, Spanglish?
Yeah. And,
oh, yeah.
and how does this all blend into this racial hierarchy? And,
what we see in the theater doesn't determine what happens in the community, although it influences politically or socially attitudes. The theater is a reflection, it's a mirror on the community. So it kind of goes both ways, but I would say the theater, as I say, these playwrights did not consciously say, I'm going to write a play about this, and I want it to mean this. This is what they were absorbing, and they, with their talent, but not with their critical eye, wrote this stuff, and then somebody had to come along to kind of interpret it, because I can guarantee, sort of like when you talk to an author of a book, of a novel or something, and you say, well, I think this means this, and they're going to say, well, no, that's not what it means, because I didn't mean it to mean that. Well, once you give a book to a reader, that's what completes the book. Well, the same thing happens with the theater. So, and as I say, they were a little self-reflective, like what happened with this La Familia Tinguillo in Clearwater. I think that Toledo realized that was overtly racist, and he modified it. He didn't make it all go away, but he modified it, so he addressed it. And there's some other plays like that too. There's one about the Korean War, and of course there's a local guy in Ybor City who is black, Cuban, who invents, he says he's trying to find funding from a Gallego who owns a little grocery store, because he has invented the bomb to end all wars. I'm sorry, this is very reminiscent of 1945, right? So it's called El Arma Secreta, the secret weapon, or El General Pelucita. Okay, Pelucita, the General Pelucita. So he invents a bomb that he wants to use over in Korea so he can end the war. And this bomb is made up of avocado on one side, and ground marañón cashew on the other side, and it's separated by a fine layer of Spanish olive oil. And that's what keeps the things from exploding. So he's trying to get this Gallego to give him the money because the Spanish olive oil is important, right? And he finally gets the funding, and then there's a really super racist song, and there's it's a rumba, and vamos cubano, vamos a ir a Corea a matar chinitos, and it's like, it's bad, you know? It's bad, but it's, I mean, there's a lot more going on in that play. But it definitely is a reflection of, by the 1960s, then you begin to see a lot of musical reviews that are nostalgic about Cuba, or Cecilia Valdez, and things like that. But in the 50s, they were still writing.
How much supporting literature do we have about like how these plays were received by the public newspaper? Or
Very little,
reviews?
almost nothing, because the reviews, and I've done the reviews, first of all, they weren't always reviewed, and if there was any comment in the local papers about them at all, it was to say, oh, the theater was full, or the theater was half full, or whatever, but nothing at all. It's very difficult. It's very difficult. Mauro?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment back on the question of identity. I've always, an experience, layered identity.
Yeah.
Because in my view, first we were Cuban, and then we had to decide if we were black or white the minute we landed. And Susan told me the story. The minute you landed at the port.
Yeah, it wasn't your decision, yeah.
You had to decide which car you were going to get on. So that's another identity layered. And then they're exiles, but then they're immigrants. And then we're Spanish because being white was preferred. We stopped being Cuban, and then we are, then we're Latin, and that's for solidarity with the other groups. But I think that's a public identity, and it's not at home identity.
No, it's kind of a brokered identity.
Yeah.
Yeah, brokered, that's a good word.
So it's all sign.
It's layered, and it's present.
Una empanada gallega.
It's present, it's not one or the other, it's
No,
all of them.
it's all of them.
All of the time.
And depending at what time you are more this or more that. I mean, I know that because that's my life, so.
And then we're Latin, then we're Hispanic, and then we're Latino.
Right.
And we're Latino in order to connect with, the Chicano movement.
Yeah, the Puerto Ricans.
And the
Puerto
Puerto
Ricans and all that, yeah.
for political power.
Yeah. But and then with the intermarriage, I mean, there are people, have a Spanish or a Cuban and an Italian, and so it really, but yeah, it's sort of, I mean, this is how I operate personally, and I'm not from here. I feel like it sometimes, but I mean, basically, look at my name. Do I sound Cuban to you?
No.
Kenya? No, not really.
Dworkin.
No, yeah, very Cuban, yeah. Actually, it was originally Dworkin, so I didn't change it, my father did. But anyways, actually, I remember telling you that when I first started coming here doing all these interviews and going to all these coffee clashes, I would meet all these viejitos, and some of them couldn't remember my name, but I would come back like 4 times a year sometimes, so they would see me all the time. Some of them thought I lived here and went up north to work, instead of the reverse, right? But they couldn't remember Kenya Dworkin, so my second name is Carmen, and my second surname is Mendez. So I would tell them I was Carmen Mendez, that they could remember. And then I'd forget I told them that. So one time, I'm at the cash and carry, the check and charity market, and I'm looking at something in the produce section. I'm hearing way in the back, I didn't turn around, no era conmigo. I mean, it's like, And then finally it gets closer and closer, and when I turn around, there's like these 2 viejitas that I know, and it's like, oh, hola, ¿qué tal? It's like, I didn't remember I had told them I was Carmen Mendez, but I couldn't remember my name. So, but I mean, for me, I have Jewish background, I have Spanish, Cuban, Polish, Russian. I mean, I grew up in a Jewish Catholic family. I mean, it's everything. So I am who I need to be when I need to be. That's right. And years ago, I learned, with all the identity tension in politics, it's like, when people would tell me, oh, don't you, they figured I had an identity crisis. No, you're the one with the crisis. I'm comfortable with all of them. So, who's got the problem? You, right? But you know what? I felt empowered when I came here, as I said at the beginning, to say that, because I found all these layers. I had never been exposed to that. It was either this, you were either Cuban or nothing. I mean, that's basically what I grew up with, right? So, yeah.
Can we see this layering as a hybridization of who we were meant to be, but with all these interactions with other cultures and ethnics, we make our own self?
I agree, and as a matter of fact, I mentioned that because basically in Revista Internacional, the first play, basically the argument is that all those other elements go into Cuban identity at the end. All of them. So everybody was in Cuba, the English, I mean, you name it, everybody was there. So that's the argument there. Genera Cubano invites everyone to join him on the stage because we're all Cuban. And I totally agree with that.
And there was a common surname in Martin Maceo, O'Farrell.
Oh yeah, because it was a very famous theater person too, yeah.
So it really was, and a number of the people that I knew had
English surnames.
had Chinese relatives.
Yeah, right.
It was very sort of common for African and Chinese
Mhm.
combinations in Cuba.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's all mixed up.